remote meetup. It's lovely to see everybody. I'm glad we were able to do this. It's not under ideal circumstances, of course. Not even ideal from a remote perspective because I'm here only catching half of my words. But I think this could be a really great format, especially from an accessibility perspective, and allowing everybody to join who might not ordinarily be able to. And certainly we've got people from out of the province and all over the place joining, and that's lovely to see. So hopefully we can keep that, keep some of that positivity even as things go back to normal. And I'd like to have this sort of remote, certainly streaming presentations or having some kind of remote presence as we move forward, I think would be great. And certainly easy for me to do this format and not have to worry about venues and catering and everything. So I like it. I hope we get a lot of value out of this. And certainly we can, it's much easier for us to get speakers like Travis when we don't have to worry about finding people and coordinating people who are only available to show up at a local venue. But with that, I will let Travis, for the most part, introduce himself. But Travis is generously joining us from SPS Commerce, where he's a software developer, and he's going to be sharing a lot of insights about SPS and their journey towards continuous delivery and facilitating flow of value in the organization. And I've got a ton of respect for SPS. I think technically they're an exceptional organization. I've seen a ton of really talented people come out of there, go into there and come out of there, and a lot of really valuable insights shared. So very happy to have him. I actually caught a variation of this presentation at another DevOps meetup, and I said, this is totally something that our crowd would dig. And I haven't seen many really comprehensive presentations on feature flags and feature toggles. So very, very pleased to have Travis break it down for us. And I think we'll get a ton of value out of this. Want to remind everybody that we've also got the Slack rolling. So I will try to be present there. I'm going to be keeping track of this chat here and Slack, but probably keeping a closer eye on this chat. So if you've got questions or anything you want to mention, feel free to dump them in the chat, and we'll make sure that Travis answers some pressing questions, and we'll try and make it a little interactive. But as always, the conversation continues on Slack. And if you're interested in signing up for that, send me a message and I'll send you a link to sign up if you're not signed up. With that, we have some wonderful news. Ari is joining us from JFrog, who's our new sponsor for the next 6 months. And I'm going to throw to him and let him say a couple words about JFrog.
Hey, Steve, thank you so much for that. Hi, everyone. I'm Ari Waller, and I'm the Meetup Event Manager at JFrog. And we're really, really excited to be a new sponsor for DevOps Toronto. JFrog is a software company based in Silicon Valley, known for our DevOps software. If you haven't heard of us before, you may have heard of our flagship product, Artifactory, which is the world's leading binary repository. Starting from the first Artifactory OS version in 2006, that's even 2 years before JFrog was actually founded as a company. We've always had our roots in the technical community. And today we have 600 employees in 10 offices globally, over 6,000 customers, and more than 3 million developers use our tools daily. So it's a real honor and privilege to be part of your community today. Trying to bring, I'm not sure in Toronto, all the rules that are in place in terms of staying indoors, but in the States, we've been hit pretty hard. So we want to give a little bit of quarantine cheer, even though we can't meet face to face. We have a June sweepstakes for all of those who are present at one of our sponsored events on a monthly basis. And this month, we are raffling off 2 Nintendo Switch Lites with Animal Crossing games. So there is a QR code and there's a bit.ly. And I'll even put the bit.ly in the chat a little shortly. But we'll do drawings at the end of the month, and hopefully someone here will be our winner. Also, even if and anyone that enters for that drawing, I'm still going to give away 3 really cool JFrog Iron Frog t-shirts tonight. And we'll announce or contact those winners within the next 28 to 48 hours. So hopefully you'll take advantage of that as well. I live in my JFrog t-shirts, and in fact, before I even knew what JFrog did, I was already collecting their t-shirts. Next slide we have is a pretty exciting event coming up. I'm not sure if you can go ahead and change that slide, Steve. And it's our annual DevOps conference. So every year we have our DevOps conference for JFrog called Swamp Up. And this year, Swamp Up 2020 is going to be going virtual. This year, we actually have some really awesome speakers. As you can see, the founder of Jenkins is going to be there, Jessica Dean from an Azure vendor from Microsoft, and the vice president of DevOps from Red Hat. So we've got some really great keynotes there. And we have 5 free passes that we're going to give away at the meetup tonight. So I wanted to, actually, can I, should I put that code in the, chat shortly as well, Steve?
Sure, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we can do that.
So here's the good news. The first 5 people that put in this code, you're going to get in for free. But 100% of all the proceeds for the event are going towards COVID-19. So even if you get in for free, JFrog's making that donation on your behalf. We're not skipping out on a donation for sure. And also, the good news is it's only $20 a ticket for some amazing talks. And these are just 3 highlights. We've got a lot of other tracks and exciting industry leaders that are going to be speaking as well. So I wanted to make sure you knew about that, and hopefully everyone's not virtual meeting out by that time, because I know it's been a long trek. But anyway, we really appreciate the opportunity to be part of your community, and just really excited to hear Travis and hear the rest of this evening. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Ari. That's much appreciated. And I'll make the deck available afterwards. Really, if anybody wants to check that out and look at the slides again in more detail, I'll throw a link in the chat because I got a link to the slides. So with that, I will throw to Travis and let him take over the presentation.
Sure, that sounds great. Still says you're sharing, Steve. I'll let you stop, or do I just overwrite
because I paused my share, so
you're good now.
Maybe this works.
Yep. Host disabled participant screen sharing, it says.
Oh man, what do you know? Wait, I can make you host.
Sure.
Uno momento.
If you give me host, does that mean you can't take it back? Just checking what kind of power I get here once I become the host.
I don't know. Let's see. Yeah, it looks like you're, I don't know, you've got it all.
All right, perfect. We're going to take this a little bit different direction than today, maybe. No. You should be able to see the title slide there.
I can, yeah.
Perfect, okay. So yeah, I'm super excited to be able to join you guys. This was a talk that I had scheduled for GlueCon and for DevOpsCon this year. And of course, everything's sliding and shifting, and who knows if these in-person events are going to happen. I know GlueCon's been pushed to the end of the year, and maybe that'll still happen. I'm not sure, but nevertheless, it's great to be able to join you and continue to share and talk about DevOps, which I'm super passionate about, and I know a lot of us at SPS Commerce are, as Steve mentioned. I'm joining you from just north of Toronto, 20 minutes past Barrie up in Aurelia, and then 10 minutes outside of that. So kind of in the middle of nowhere a bit, but just good enough that I think I get decent internet. And so give me a thumbs up for the people that I can see if quality's okay. Are we all right? Yep, I'm getting 2 thumbs, 2 out of 30. That's not bad. Good. Okay, great. Thanks, guys. So today we are talking about feature flags, and we're not talking about national flags, despite what the picture looks like. And really a feature flag is really just that config switch, right? That if statement that tells me whether I'm gonna do something or not, and how that can affect and change my entire culture for deployment into production. So as we get started, I'll just briefly explain a little bit about where I'm coming from, a bit about me. You already know my name's Travis, and I work as a software engineer at SPS Commerce. And SPS Commerce you probably haven't heard of. We're a B2B company with the largest retail network in the world. And so we're not necessarily a household name because we do work with obviously companies in there, but we do have a lot of great products in terms of a fulfillment product that drives our network to exchange EDI documents between suppliers and retailers. We have assortment that allows us to basically show off catalogs between suppliers and retailers and allow them to exchange that information. When you go to a web page and you see all the details about what makes up a product and the dimensions and everything, that's all coming out of one of those types of assortment catalogs that we offer as a product. And finally, we also have a ton of analytics products that allow suppliers and retailers to try and dig into their data and really understand some of the data that's flowing and some of their POS related transactions and those types of things. Our network has over 4,200 retailers today, including Costco, Walmart, Target, Academy Sports, Bass Pro, Cabela's. And so we do drive a lot of traffic that way. And amongst the COVID scenario right now and the times that we're in, obviously, e-shopping and all those types of electronic data interchange is just skyrocketed. And so we're seeing a lot of those volumes just increase substantially. But like many other companies, SPS Commerce has been on this DevOps journey, right, for the last X number of years, 10 plus. And, first getting into Agile, figuring out how do we really do Agile? What is Agile? What does that mean? And then now into DevOps and what does DevOps mean? And really figuring out that, makes our culture special. And it's really a state of mind in how we develop. Some of the key things that we're working towards are continuous, whether that be continuous integration, continuous deployment, continuous delivery, but just in general, the idea of continuously getting better at what we do is important to us. And the most important thing there that I like is the continuous feedback loop. So whatever we can do, whatever we're building, as long as we have a continuous feedback loop of critiquing and criticism and error logging and automation, I think we're headed in the right direction. And that's the second part there, which is automation. We try to automate as much as we can and try and get back some of our team's velocity and where we can spend our time. And sharing. And that's one of the reasons I'm excited to join you guys today, is just be able to share and discuss and chat more with the community about DevOps in general. One of the key roadblocks for us in DevOps, when we talk about it, has been this particular problem I'm about to describe. Let me just walk through this, and maybe we'll pause and I'll try and get your feedback on, is this a problem? Is this something you can relate to from your particular team or organization? So let's look at it from a standard development perspective. I'll describe a kind of a software development lifecycle as we go through this. But you have your source control system. For us, that's GitHub and Git, and you're probably in something similar or some Git-based source control system. Either way, you may have some sort of master branch, in which case our master branch is always a deployable unit, something that's always ready to go to production. At least that's what we want it to be. That's what we strive for. We don't always hit that. And when we want to develop something, we create a feature branch for that. And we carve off that feature branch, we do a bunch of updates, and we're really, we may be concerned that we don't want to necessarily merge that back to master branch yet, because master is always deployable. And what I'm doing is only half baked or half finished, and that's not really ready to be deployed. So therefore it can't go into master. That drives a couple of other problems and friction throughout our organization. We'll come back to that in a minute. But we go ahead and we create this green feature there, this green set of code. We don't know what it is, but for the sake of the discussion, it's a new feature that we're building. We pull request that back in, and that merges back into our master branch. In our master branch, then we have our CI automatically set up, and that goes ahead and automatically versions and creates this atomic version 1.2 for us. And of course, our continuous delivery system kicks off and automatically deploys version 1.2 into a development environment. And that's great. We're seeing some of that continuous automatic feedback now, where I can really get in and test that amongst the entire ecosystem in the dev environment. You might have several other systems, or I should say environments, in between dev and production. For this illustration, though, we'll just say that we're heading to production next, and production has version 1.1 right now. But this is where kind of the friction sets in. This is where the problems set in that start to hold us back. And that's because the infamous gate comes in and blocks our deployment from dev to prod. We can't continuously deploy there. Why not? This gate is different things in different organizations. Maybe in your organization or team, that's a quality assurance team. Maybe it's some sort of buddy testing that you've implemented, and your other member of the team has indicated that there's actually a quality issue there. We can't deploy that to production yet. Or perhaps it's a product owner who's saying, this was actually scheduled to go out next week. You can't release this to our customers yet. It's not ready. Or maybe that product owner has decided that there's a change. We're not actually going to push that feature out like we had discussed anymore, because we're an agile company and we like to iterate fast as we get something into dev, and the product owner puts their hands on it and go, this is not really what I thought it was going to be. We can't release that. So for any number of reasons, we're blocked. While we're waiting for that resolution, whether it be a bug fix or change or updated requirements from the product owner, we start working on our other feature branch. And that's just kind of off on the side. And then as we're halfway into that branch and trying to get it finished and code it up on the next feature, bug fix comes in, critical bug fix. And we need to get that out to production ASAP, and that's our release 1.1. So we go ahead and we cut that branch, we work on that red piece of code, we merge it back into master, and our CI/CD automatically kicks off and gets us all the way through to the dev environment. Dev looks good, but I think you're starting to see now the friction that I'm talking about. This is one of the key problems that I have with this, which is, well, now I have a version 1.3 that's released to our dev environment. How do I get that into production now, knowing that I can't actually release that green piece of code that's there? And so this has created a pretty big problem. And I think all of us who have constructed any CI/CD pipelines would at this point recognize some of the other alternatives that we could have done. We could have used multiple active release branches, and perhaps instead of off of our master branch, we're actually maintaining some release branches for 1.1. In that 1.1 branch, we would have made a change. We would have maybe cherry picked that change back into master when it was ready. And then we would have had our CI system with that particular version kick off and build that. And so we would have had version 1.1.1. Then you have to make a decision. Do I deploy version 1.1.1 to dev environment, or maybe my DevOps practices allow me to stand up entirely new environments for dev for every version? That offers some sanity. But nevertheless, if I'm deploying to this dev environment here, am I willing to support backwards and forwards compatibility with a number of the dependencies around me? Meaning, can I downgrade version 1.2 to version 1.1 when maybe I have other complex database changes that are expecting a higher version? And it can be done, absolutely it can be done, but dealing with this level of complexity is not something that I find advantageous to do on a day-to-day, especially when I just want to be able to commit into master and keep this pipeline flowing through with a lot of simplicity. On top of all that, consider this a microcosm, right? This is one service, perhaps on a team that supports dozens more, perhaps in an organization that has hundreds or more. And so you also have other internal dependencies or other services that are kind of waiting on that. I need version 1.2 in production. Where is that? I need to test out this other feature or continue working on this while you resolve that other problem. That could be internally, that could be externally, but we know that people are waiting on it. And so we've kind of locked ourselves in here to dealing with a lot of complexity. So maybe I'll just pause for a moment there and see, is that something you guys can relate to, you've experienced? Feel free to, I think people can unmute. If you want to unmute and tell me about where you guys are at, or if you've experienced that, feel free to.
Yeah, we should be able to come out off of mute, but I know I've certainly seen it before.
I used to run into it back before we actually started doing trunk-based development and feature flags.
You're saying feature flags are the solution?
Been using them for about 2.5, 3 years at this point, and they're wonderful.
Excellent. Yep. Yeah, and that's where we're about to head. Anybody else have any experiences or any other ideas of how they've approached the situation?
Yeah, Travis, even I have experienced this very well, many times.
Sure. Let's keep moving, and we'll talk about that solution, which I think it was Peter. Peter jumped the gun on us there on the feature flag solution, but let's talk about what that feature flag solution looks like. We're in source control. We got our master branch. We're focusing more on that trunk-based development, and we go ahead and carve off a feature branch. Now that's questionable. I mean, it's great if you can work directly in your master branch. There's a lot of teams who prefer not to, but either way, as long as we're focusing on getting our changes back to that master branch as soon as we can, Some people use the estimate of a day. Like if you're not committing to your master branch at least once a day, you're probably doing it wrong. If you're doing it more often than that, fantastic. But branching gives us at least some ability to go through a pull request and a status check kind of process as well in there. Either way, that's fine. We're going to go ahead and follow the same process, and we're going to develop that green feature. But before we merge it back in, we're going to throw in a feature flag, as Peter described. And this feature flag, for the sake of the conversation, is just going to be an if statement, right? Like if this is true, which may be an environment variable or a config setting somewhere, then go ahead and execute this piece of code. So we're going to hide that, and we might even, in fact, just turn it off by default. So that way, when we merge it back into master, it may not even be finished. And those other consumers of master, whether that be other developers or engineers, or perhaps our CI/CD system that's kicking off, they're none the wiser that I've actually have this piece of code committed to my master branch that's going to deploy to production. That's just turned off, just not accessible, so to speak. And I can continue to iterate on it and work on it with it being turned off at the master level. So like before, we're going to get our version 1.2 built and ready, and get it into our dev environment with our full continuous deployment. And this time, instead of being blocked on the deployment to prod, we're just going to push it right into prod. And we can do that because we have that environment variable turned off by default for this. So we've deployed the code base to production, but that feature actually isn't available. And so if there was a bug in it, if there was a reason not to deploy it in terms of marketing or product owner not saying it's ready, doesn't matter because nobody can see it yet anyways. And so we're moving this decision to a generic term, which we might call a feature decision provider, something external to the environment itself, maybe an environment variable, but even more so, or even better, would be some type of service that we can communicate with and just let it make the decisions on whether these features are turned on or off. And so that's where we can move our gate to. That gate now exists specifically there, interacting between the feature decision provider and each individual environment. And the decision can be made at each environment independently. So if I don't want to have this on in my master, but I want to have it on in dev or some other environment, I can do that. Additionally, that bug fix comes in now, that critical bug fix that we have to do, that's no problem, right? I can merge that right in, get it right out into production because I'm not blocked on that green feature being there. I can turn it off independently and entirely decoupled from the release. Also, feature flags are highly productive and offer huge advantages when you can consider using them with a context. Some type of context about who's using me. It could be an HTTP header. It could be a role. Could be an email address. Could be anything related to authorization or authentication that identifies somebody. So in this case, those external or internal services that were waiting on this production release, it might not be ready for the external customers to use, but maybe these other dependencies, I want to give them access to it early. I can do that by using any of those contextual information pieces that I talked about to just say, oh, this feature is actually just on for these two services, so you guys can test out and begin your integration in the production level. And so the whole thing then comes together with the decoupling of your deployment and your release. They're now two independent decisions happening entirely independent of each other. Does that, I'll pause there for a minute. Anybody have any questions? Or obviously this is the topic we're gonna dive much deeper in right now, but any thoughts up front?
I have one. And during development of the project, eventually we will reach to several hundreds of environment variables or config entries. How to manage it?
Yeah, so how would we manage like hundreds of these feature flags that we might have that we would be introducing? Is that what your question was?
Yeah.
Yeah, let's, if we can, let's defer that one for a couple more slides down the road, and we're going to talk about some of those management and talk about how a feature decision provider can really help you with some of that management. Good question.
And the second question, how to manage environment variables or configuration for these features? Because many software platforms will check config and the existence of this variable, even if you will not use this code, but they will check existence of environment variable with specific content. And even if you won't use this code, it still will fail start because this environment variable non-exists, blah, blah, blah.
So environment variables are a great way to talk about feature flagging, just as an example. And the reason that is, let me just jump forward one slide here, is the way that Martin Fowler describes it. And Martin Fowler is great. No presentation is complete without a good Fowler quote, but he describes it as a powerful technique allowing teams to modify system behavior without changing code. So we talk about the use of environment variables because that's obviously a key area in an immutable container that we can change a behavior without changing the code itself. But in actuality, if we really want to take advantage of the flags and we want to take advantage of how we manage them and orchestrate this process moving forward, we will need something better, in my opinion, than a simple environment variable. An environment variable, for example, doesn't allow me to get to the granularity of an individual request changing a feature. It's kind of everything's on or everything's off as a whole, and requires a lot of redeployment of systems potentially to change that environment variable. I think that's what you're getting at. I missed some of your question, and that's where, you know, the suggestion here is to actually, you can do it in its simplest form with a environment variable, but there's much better techniques and better ways to do it using other dependencies like a feature decision provider. So let's keep maybe rolling, and we'll see if that question gets better answer materialized to some of the other slides. If not, definitely pull it back up towards the end, Victor, please. So yeah, whatever you call them, config flags, feature toggles, flippers, and we're going to talk a little bit about where we can store them and how they're managed. But at a high level, when we talk about them, wherever they live, and whether they're environment variables or whether they're you know, in feature decision providers or just in your configuration file, there are 4 key types that we talk about, 4 classifications of a flag that help us think about flags in different ways. First one would be a release, and that's kind of what we talked about, where that product owner, you know, is driving you to build this particular feature for a system. I want it released on this date for our customers or anything like that, and they can coordinate that, and we can kind of pull that flag out right away and get past it, because it's very important to clean the flags up so they don't get out of control, as you suggested, with hundreds of flags. The second type would be an operational type of flag, and that's something that more exists from an engineering perspective, that exists for us to be able to not necessarily create a new feature, but we would use it as a technical flag to modify behavior somehow. That might be performance-related behavior. It might be migrating to you know, another dependency from one. You might be doing some type of traffic shaping where you just want to change out some of your dependencies in the back end. And that's where you use an operational flag, and that might be left in a little longer than a release flag. Experiment. Experimental flags are an interesting approach where obviously we see some organizations doing this more than others. It drives me crazy that Netflix does so much experimentation with some of their features, because I log in one day and then I log in the next day and everything's changed. And so I've always thought of that as something that I don't want to do in terms of the amount of experimentation they do, because it obviously drives me crazy. I hate it. But nevertheless, we can use it to gauge some really good understanding of does a user prefer, you know, option A or option B on a feature, and drive different configurations with that and explore that with them. And a permission flag is usually a little more permanently lived, and it's there for longer. We can use it to drive just general permissions in our application, which we're going to talk more about. I generally think that that's a bad idea to introduce to your feature decision provider, but nevertheless, it is an option. You can also use it for things like alpha testing or some of those canary releases, or just giving early access to certain features or previews. And so there's a lot that feature flags drive in terms of the flexibility that we get with them. That branching strategy, maybe it's going to completely change, right? Maybe you're going to do more straight trunk-based development. You're going to commit directly to master and just work right out of master. That would be fantastic. Maybe you're just going to have shorter-lived feature branches, knowing that my work doesn't have to be complete before I merge it back in. Either way, that's really going to drive a truer sense of CI for yourself, of that continuous integration, because continuous integration, the way it should be, is really when you're integrating your code and running all your tests and automation amongst everybody else's code, not where you're in separate feature branches and you're just committing code to those and building all independently, right? And then on top of that, it's going to allow you to ship faster. Why? Well, because I don't have to wait for some of these gates to be approved. They're entirely different decisions now. I can more confidently deploy. And that's because I know that I can turn off this feature anytime if I need to. I'll be wanting to ship more often. It's easier for me to reason about an issue when my environments line up and when I'm just pushing things through a lot faster. And if you do need to roll back that feature, well, you're not doing an entire version rollback of your application. You're actually just turning certain things on and off. And testing in production, all of a sudden with this one technique, testing in production, if you haven't done it before, is very easily achievable. With the key aspect that I could turn on a feature simply for myself or for my team or for a role. It allows those canary releases, and also consider whether this allows the reduction of other environments that you may have had that served a particular purpose. As an example, maybe you had a test environment before that was used from a QA perspective, if you had a QA team, or maybe you used it with your own team in order to test out the software in that environment independent of dev. Maybe you can just say, forget that. We're just going to do that in production now, knowing that the environment and the feature can be turned off. And I think you'd want to think about the cultural change that it has, culturally how it affects your development workflow. This changes a lot, right? We made so many decisions before we moved to feature flags that were based on stacking up dependencies and when they get deployed, and this has to be done before that, and then this, and then just the coordination effort is eliminated, and things flow a lot more freely, and you can focus on what you need to release, and that really has an impact and change on your culture. And whether it's a good idea or a bad idea, some teams have incorporated product owners as a part of it. Some feature flag enthusiasts really think that product owners and anyone outside the team should be abstracted from being able to control those flags. We've definitely incorporated that in some teams where our product owners work really closely with the team, and we consider them an embedded member of the team, so to speak. And so we kind of put that release flag perspective onto the product owner plate to say, hey, you tell us when this is good and you're happy with it, and then we'll coordinate the lifecycle cleanup of those flags. So it can change your culture, I think, for the better, truly towards more of a DevOps style. The ultimate goal, really, I think, of any software engineering team is to deliver high quality software. And it has to solve a business problem, obviously, and it also needs to be delivered quickly. If you're not familiar with it, there's a report called The State of DevOps, and the latest one out now, I don't think 2020 is out yet, but 2019 shows some great metrics for what really are important for software delivery and operational elitism, so to speak. And those performance metrics are here. And you can see that the elite status or the elite metric is indicated on how many times elite teams are doing these sort of things. But each and every one of these metrics is really enabled in some way by feature flags, whether that be how often we deploy or the time to restore a service when there's an outage, knowing that we no longer have to revert it way back. We're actually just disabling a feature. And so definitely consider that as you're working towards that DevOps mentality and pattern, that this technique, I believe, has a large impact and blast radius beyond just what we're talking about here. So enough of that. Let's jump in. Let's look at a simple example. And I'm hoping that this might maybe answer some of the questions if you haven't used a feature flag before and some of the management. And let's talk about that. So in this simple case, we have a simple method. We're passing in a user context, and we're just asking it to set up a user. So the first thing it does is it goes and creates a user. Well, we're not too worried about the intricacies of creating a user, whatever your identity system might be, and setting that up and persisting the information. But what the feature that we need to introduce now is a new feature related to sending an email. We want to let that user know that their account has been set up. And so in this case, we're going to introduce this feature flag. And it's going to have a piece of code that we're going to execute. And it's very simple, which is basically, is SendGrid email enabled? And if you're not familiar with it, SendGrid is an example of a software as a service provider to send emails. And so we're just asking whether we can go ahead and execute the code that should actually send the SendGrid email inside of it. And in its simplest form, that's a feature flag. However, what does that is SendGrid email enabled actually do? Maybe it just returns true behind it. But as we stated earlier, Martin Fowler's definition, remember, that actually required us to be able to change this behavior from outside the code base. So this technically doesn't qualify entirely. This might qualify, in this case, app configuration, and that might be from your environment variables in the simplest form on whether we should use SendGrid or not. Or that might be just from a config file that's on the system, all depending on where you're at in your architecture and deployment style. But ideally, again, as we're moving, from left to right on simplicity to more advanced, you're really going to be grabbing that feature information and whether that flag is enabled from somewhere else, somewhere external. An HTTPS dependency of some kind would be great. And so here we can ask that service, do you have this feature? And we'll just supply it a key that we've set up on the other side that tells us yes or no, basically, whether to use it or not. And now we can easily, in any environment, kind of deploy this out and really flip that flag on or off for that feature. But in reality, in a lot of cases with feature flags, you're not simply adding that new code, at least not in my experience. There's always an augmentation, which is, you're actually removing this or doing this instead of that or switching things out. And so your simple if statement here gets a little more complex. Instead, we're going to do an if-else statement where perhaps your previous functionality was we were using a local SMTP server to send that email. And now we're migrating away from that. We're actually going to say, get rid of that and now incorporate SendGrid as our provider moving forward. And so this is getting exciting because now I can see how I can get into production and I can disable or enable this pretty straightforward, pretty easily. But there's one key that we're missing, which is we haven't actually provided that user context in the initial is SendGrid email enabled to the feature decision provider, which means that this is either going to be on for everybody or off for everybody. So that test in production concept with that user context really needs to be enabled by providing that user information. And so our is SendGrid enabled email enabled function is going to change to take in a user, and we're going to pass a series of user context information, role, email, whatever you can think of that you want to provide to that feature decision service. And it's going to let us know based on a lot of those things whether we can proceed. Now I can go there and say, hey, when I'm creating a new user and their first name is Travis, because that's my test user, I want you to go ahead and use the new provider. And I can test that all in production without anybody else knowing about it. There are some pretty important realizations I think we've come to at this point. And this is actually one of the reasons why I wanted to develop this information and put it together, because when I first got into feature flags, these are some of the things that I struggled with, where I was like, this does not make sense, or is this really the cost of working with feature flags? So based on our simple example that we just looked at, let's talk about some of those important realizations that we may be having at this moment. First is the idea of shifting left, right? That we're basically taking something that we used to manage through releases and deployments, and we're shifting that into our code. When we release something is now in our code base instead of abstracted elsewhere. And the reason why that is a good thing, why we want that complexity in our code and not elsewhere, is because we can deal with it in code. We have so many more mechanisms in our code base to deal and handle that are not available in your standard source control, or are not available in the same simplicity that we can handle here. So we can deal with that shifting left in the code a lot easier to apply to the architecture. Not only that, keep in mind that I have lots of other things to support me in that endeavor, like unit testing. I can test out both these paths and I can clarify all those different variations as needed. The next realization would be maintainability. Think about the complexity we just added to that simple case. We increased the complexity of that function probably pretty substantially with all the downstream dependencies and the feature decision provider. So that complexity is there, absolutely. It feels like a lot at first, but the more you work with it and the more you manage those flags and have a process for dealing with them, it becomes pretty straightforward. But nevertheless, you're going to work with some more advanced features that you're going to use this technique on. And the idea of maintaining both of those code paths is daunting in some cases. And you have to figure out ways and techniques and patterns that we'll talk about in a bit of dealing with some of those different, larger cases. Short, it costs more. There's more development time, right? And so if you're thinking that I'm going to use feature flags because it's going to allow me to develop the feature faster, I would think that you're sorely mistaken. If you're thinking that that's going to allow me to, as an entire life cycle of that, get it into production faster and test it against production data and in that ecosystem, then yeah, you will. And that's the value add that we want. Changes to existing code. In this case, we had a simple if-else statement. But in other cases, in order to get your code base to a spot where, for example, you're able to swap out a piece of functionality, there is a small surface area of code that is not feature flagged, that is going to be deployed and could break your system without that feature flag being on. That's what I kind of call it the orchestration code, where you have to make changes to put in the if else statement potentially, or refactor it slightly so that it kind of gets into the nested code block, or depending on where you're adding it and how you're working with those toggles. There is a small percentage of concern that you're going to make a mistake, and I've done it myself. I've broken production thinking that I introduced something behind a flag, and it, I messed it up. Short answer is those things are usually fairly binary decisions, meaning that once I get into the dev environment, a quick little test against that probably proves that I didn't break everything and the old code path is still working. Second, unit test it. If you're moving ahead with test-driven development or proper testing patterns, usually you catch those things pretty quick. At least I know that I do. And I can definitely relate back to the times where I screwed up production. It's because I didn't have adequate tests, in my opinion. And fourthly, the important realization, which Victor was pointing out earlier, is that, yeah, it's going to suck to manage some of these flags, and they're going to get out of control quick. So how do we deal with that? We deal with that with this feature decision provider, or in this case, I've labeled it as a management provider. We need some tooling to help us with that. And so with that in mind, what can I use? You can use configuration files, environment variables, and databases to do this. Absolutely, you can. And that's okay if that's where you're at with it, or that's the best that's available in your ecosystem. That still provides value, maybe not all the value we're talking about today, that you didn't have before. You can also, if you're in the cloud ecosystems, you can use the AWS SSM parameter store, or Azure also has available service, the Azure App Configuration Service, that allows you to integrate and add different configurations for each environment and use feature flags. If you're in .NET Core comes with a built-in feature decision provider that integrates directly with Azure. And there's also other tooling that you maybe have in your environment that you could use for general key value storage for these types of things, such as Console, Zookeeper, or etcd. But at the end of the day, you really want to get management of users and context and actually understanding feature flag usage across the board. You need to move beyond that. So you might look at some of the targeted or open source providers such as Unleash or Flagger or Flipped. You can bring those into your ecosystem and set them up, get them running, and they act as that extra dependency, that service that can help you. But at least at SPS Commerce, and I know a lot of other organizations, this type of work that's not differentiating to us, just farm it out if we can, assuming that we can afford that, and the cost is usually pretty small. Using a full service can really make that easy on ourselves, and there are dozens, and these are just some of the ones that are available. In particular, we use LaunchDarkly at SPS Commerce, and LaunchDarkly is a great example of a thought leader in the space that's moving ahead and just has all the features that you can want with it in order to move ahead. But all of these provide a lot of the similar features that'll get you there too. So definitely consider that. A lot of them offer lots of management concepts in terms of mapping the flags to teams and helping you clean them up and mark them and label them and configure them in 9 different ways from last week that are pretty substantial. That being said, if you haven't seen it, the ThoughtWorks Tech Radar is, I believe it's a quarterly newsletter that goes out that talks and analyzes basically ongoing techniques, platforms, technologies that are changing in the patterns of usage or worth looking into. And one of them, in the recent one that came out a couple of weeks back, it noted in its number 6 spot, simplest possible feature toggle. So a couple key things. Not as many people are using feature flags as we think should. It provides so much less friction in your deployment, but not a lot of people are taking advantage of that. And the thought here is that they're not taking advantage of that because of the cost to getting on board with some of the feature decision providers that we just talked about. And so they're suggesting to stay simple. Keep it simple. Use whatever's in your environment today. That being said, I know in my opinion, I found LaunchDarkly as an example very easy to get up and running quickly. It's adding a package and adding an SDK key. And then you're just calling a method in its simplest form that tells me if it's enabled or not. So personally, I found the advantages provided by a full feature decision provider are worth the small level of integration. But there's definitely a community pattern here developing that others are looking to get on board with it, maybe even faster and simpler than introducing that type of dependency. Pause there for a moment if anybody has thoughts or discussion points. You still there, Steve? Anything coming in on the chat side that I need to look at?
I think you're covering most of the questions that are coming up. People are asking about, obviously, how do you manage it? How do you keep it under wraps? And what kind of strategies can be employed to keep it manageable? I think you've covered a bit of that, and you might get to more of it, but I think that's always a concern. The other thing that was raised was a question about, let's say, operational and configuration flags versus code flags, or traditional development flags, and or feature flags versus operational flags, which I think is another thing that you get to as well.
Yeah, we have some good content coming up that I think will cover those. So let's hang on to those for a minute, and we'll get to
it. If anybody else, if you've got a question that you want to raise, toss it in the chat, and I'll make sure I see it. And or feel free to just raise your hand in the participant list, and I'll make sure to throw you the mic when we get a shot. But thanks, Travis. Keep it going.
Sure. So let's dive in, look at another example of a slightly different scenario. In this case, we're going to look at UI routing. And using feature flags on the UI versus on the server can be slightly different for a number of reasons. So let's look at that. In this example, this is an example piece of code, Markdown from React. And I don't know a ton about React myself. I dabble a little bit, but and you don't have to, other than to be able to analyze some of the bits that we're seeing here. And first of all, as you can see, that there is a component here for a React router toggle. And this particular component inherits from the regular React component for routing that we can use. And it goes ahead and establishes this idea of a fallback, which is essentially our feature flag. And so basically it says, that fallback, if the feature is not enabled, go ahead and display the existing feature. Otherwise, if the feature is enabled, then show me the new feature. And this is an exciting pattern to help eliminate some complexity. It's what we call toggle at the edge. And the reason that is because once we get into each one of these features, they'll be entirely independent, those pages that will be showed, and they won't know anything about the other feature. It's not that we're diving into one of these features and splitting the code base with all these if-else statements everywhere. We kind of just do it this one spot at the router level and begin to swap it as we go through. It keeps it modular and agnostic, and brings together some of those good coding practices. So what does this actually look like? You should be able to see some animations coming through there where we're clicking on it. So in the top then is showing the two list items with the home and the new feature. And then you can see that when the toggle is changed or turned off, it switches to the existing feature versus the new feature. And what's neat about this is on the bottom, we're using Launch Darkly. So that's an example of turning on a flag for everybody in Launch Darkly, back and forth. But notice that I'm not refreshing the page on the top at all. And the reason that is because using the components and the SDK from Launch Darkly, it's established a WebSocket connection so that the flag change is actually live. And that's important on a UI depending on your architecture. If you're using a single page application, that might not be reloaded for days or weeks or whoever knows how long. You're going to want to ensure that you have a WebSocket connection to it, which then drives back to your decision of a feature provider. If you're going to be picking or building your own, you're going to have to worry about, well, now I have to build an SDK or worry about some of these other complexities that really you can take advantage of very quickly, provided from some of the existing software as a service providers that are there. So I definitely encourage you to look around before choosing one and choose one that has the appropriate SDKs for the languages that you're building in, and for if you're building UI, that you have an SDK there as well. On top of that, your pricing and your cost model is totally different on the UI versus on the server. For a lot of reasons based on monthly active user counts. So depending on if you're going to go software as a service provider, definitely look at your considerations for your number of users and weigh that cost. Interestingly enough, if you don't go with WebSockets and you don't need that kind of functionality here, you can get away with just server requests and proxy it through your API if you wanted to. I know this style of toggling at the edge has led us down one route on SPS Commerce, working with one of the teams where we actually have an old school Angular JS app. And I say old school, I still love Angular JS just because it's been a while since I've done the UI, but nevertheless, we got to get out of Angular JS, the original Angular version, and get us towards React for a number of our pages. And so we've been able to integrate both those together based on toggles and build out entirely new pages built in React, and just swap into them using some of the feature flags that are there, which has been highly successful for us to migrate some of our UI applications that in the past has always been that tough decision of, do I rebuild everything or do I just carry on writing it in the original Angular JS version? And the short answer is you don't have to. There are ways to incrementally evolve, which we like in DevOps, to be iterative, and feature flags can help you there too. Let's look at another example on the API side for a couple different patterns and see how we can use it on the server. Let's say we have a users API, and that users API, let's say it's just a V1 users endpoint, and I want to introduce maybe next version, or let's say a profiles endpoint. But I don't want everybody to have access to that right away. I can use feature flags to establish at the server level where you're doing your routing, whether I want to introduce some type of early access or preview access pretty easily. And that's fantastic when you're starting to put out that other version of the API that you want your internal consumers to start using first and looking at, but not be at all discoverable outside yet. Additionally, maybe you're going to actually introduce an entire new endpoint for your users version, and feature flags are not a great way, for example, to make breaking changes. It doesn't mean you don't need any sort of versioning mechanism for your APIs. That is not what this means at all. But what it does mean is that we can, for example, begin to route anybody who's not providing a particular version. We can write them early access to a newer version, or begin to play with some of those routing rules on exactly which endpoint they're going to get if they haven't specifically specified. And then we can measure that output and measure that outcome, which is important in DevOps. Additionally, one thing that I've only used very limited, but is an interesting approach, is to use feature flags to introduce certain testing scenarios in production that may not be possible otherwise for you to create. It might be that certain users you need to be able to create, or certain aspects of the user and the data there that you want to simulate in order to test an error situation. You can use feature flags to set that up. And once you get inside the endpoint, modify the behavior, something you can typically do pretty easily in code. You just don't have an entry point for it necessarily when you get to production. And so you can simulate error states as well with feature flags. The other technique that I've seen, this is not one I've used, I'd be interested to see your feedback on it, is I know it has been done some places where they, in some cases, make breaking changes to contracts using feature flags, and they measure the outcome of that just to make sure it's not going to hurt anybody. As an example, you might be changing that status code of maybe a post request from a 200 to a 204 to indicate there's no content. Maybe the original spec called for 204 and it wasn't added, and you get the default 200. You might change that, and then you might measure the outcome of that just to make sure that there's no concerns with that, and rather than produce an entirely new version of that endpoint, as an example. One of my favorite usages of feature flags that I kind of first fell in love with them was related to migrations. And so if you're anything like many of the other organizations out there right now, you're decomposing different monolithic applications that you have, trying to figure out and trying to, instead of rewrite everything, you're trying to rewrite portions of it and separate it and scale them separately with different types of workloads. So in this case, you might have your typical monolithic gateway API that's maybe serving a web application of some kind, or some other users that are consuming it. And then behind it, you have your monolithic database. And in this case, we had a scheduling engine behind this that existed in the gateway application and in the monolith that we needed to kind of rip out of there and rewrite entirely. And so we did that in parallel, moved the schema components over, rewrote the new scheduling engine, and then we were able to use feature flags to just basically redirect the traffic over to it, right? In some cases, that was great. That allows us to easily test it out in a test scenario in production. But of course, we weren't able to actually turn that on without some sort of data synchronization that would move the monolithic data over to the new schema. But in that case, this is where you can use feature flags to get a little more complex. You might actually introduce multiple flags to allow you to do this without a synchronization. And one flag might be for read and one flag might be for write. And then you can easily, depending on your scenario, decide it's important for me to have the write flag turned on first, which is a way of offering you to synchronize your data and keep it up to date. So I can do a one-time synchronization and then just write to both places to keep it up to date from there on out. Depending on how far your data goes back, you might just be able to start writing data, and after a month, the data is no good anyway. So you can turn the feature on at that point without having to do any synchronization, depending on your scenario. In our example, it was important that we tested out the read functionality first. So we implemented a synchronization on the back end that kept it in sync, and then we flipped over all read traffic to the new scheduling API. And this allowed us to basically test out the full load in production of the oncoming dependency that was coming through. And in a number of cases, we had to turn the flag off. It's like, flip it on. It's like, oh, we were not ready for that. And that was not something we could simulate in a different environment. Performance testing is hard. And no matter how deep you dive on it or how good you think you can do it, there's always typically production scenarios that you just can't account for. And so that's why I love the ability to be able to test it in production and then back it out very quickly and confidently if we need to. Some other scenarios, we can't cover all of them today, but here's some other ones to think about. Log level verbosity. You can switch your log level verbosity based on a feature flag. So if you're in, you're only looking at warnings, but you want to go down to the trace level to debug something, you can use a feature flag to switch that. That might be a good example of an operational feature flag, and maybe something that's more long-lived, for example, than a release flag that you would tend to take out a lot sooner. Additionally, I've heard of people also automating that. So when a series of thresholds is broken with X number of errors per second coming in, automatically go ahead and flip the flag over, so you start getting trace level information immediately, and then flip it off when that error rate dies down, and then you have that available to you without doing it manually. Dynamic configuration. Consider how you can use feature flags, not just for Boolean values, true or false. You can also do dynamic configs, so think JSON blobs, or even what we call multivariant configurations, where you specify like an enumeration style of these are the variable options. Kill switches are another great example of you need to disable that third-party dependency that's just killing you. You need to get rid of that Google Analytics on your page because they're slowing you down for some reason, or having issues themselves. Or maybe even just other internal code paths, other dependencies you introduce, like the example I just showed you with the scheduling API that you just need to kill and really fall back to something else under heavy load. And we talk a lot about introducing features with feature flags, but you can also sunset features in an interesting way with feature flags. Namely, maybe you want to stop all new clients or customers who are signing up for accounts from getting certain features, just so you can at least limit the scope of who has it and then deal with getting rid of it from their accounts. Additionally, maybe you're risky enough that you're just going to go ahead and take it away from everybody and see who complains, and then just use feature flags to turn it back on for that one customer account. There's definitely a lot of options there for sunsetting features too. And timed features is another great example that I know the product owners absolutely love, whether that be something that I just want to turn on for the holiday season, a banner, or some type of feature or promo code or something. And then also I can easily turn it off after that, or have it on a schedule, and I don't necessarily have to do a deploy to get it ready. We've all heard great examples of all these features and coming online at conferences. And there were times, I remember certain conferences where those features just explode because they're trying to coordinate a deployment of it coming on at the same time. But in actuality nowadays, if you're going to do that sort of thing, it's probably behind a feature flag, and it's been tested by a ton of people before it's turned on to the massive public to be timed with a conference release.
We had one other question about reliability. And this would be great to hear from your perspective, Travis. In SPS, you guys are obviously serving some pretty high priority traffic. Are there any concerns about availability of LaunchDarkly or LaunchDarkly having an impact on your production services if they were to encounter some kind of a problem?
That's a really good one. that's, you know, that's probably something I need to add in here. I've mentioned it. I know when I've done some previous talks, it's come up as well. And yeah, huge. And that's why when you get into the whole microservice kind of architecture in the world, one of the things you're looking to do is to decrease the number of dependencies that any given service has on another one, right? If you have that single service that everyone is dependent on, it's not ideal. And so you're looking for ways to reduce that. But when we're talking about feature flags, we're talking about you're about to connect potentially every single service to a single dependency. And so that's first and foremost why I talk about the, you know, the idea of the differentiating and the non-differentiating work. I rely on the software as a service provider, that feature decision provider, in this case LaunchDarkly for SPS, to be top of their game to ensure that that service isn't going to go down. Does it go down? Yes. Yes, I've seen it. We've had it happen. And how it behaves is kind of up to you a bit. In a lot of cases, when you have that if statement where you're checking to see, is this flag enabled, yes or no, it typically has a default that you can provide or override and even provide custom configuration. So if all else fails and this flag blows up and for whatever reason I can't communicate with the decision provider, what do you want me to do? And that's a good use case to consider and handle as you're writing your code. But that being said, it gets kind of a little bit squirrely when you get to that point where you've actually turned the flag on for everyone. Because then if your decision provider goes down and you've said, hey, default this to off, you've now actually, you know, 2 weeks into having this feature live, you've just reverted back to the old one because you haven't removed it yet. And so that would be another great case of why you want to clean up these feature flags as quickly and as often as you can. And just in terms of what we've seen with LaunchDarkly, probably in the last 6 months, there are 2 incidents that I can think of. And of course, the types of changes or behaviors to the system that affects is different in each case, but definitely something that has come up. And you want to look at your feature decision providers and look at their uptime and look at their SLAs and their contracts and consider that. It's a great question. All right, I'll keep going here, Steve, and we'll stop for more questions here in a sec. There's a couple questions that had come up, I think, earlier there, maybe from Victor or for someone else about configuration. So let's spend just a brief second on configuration. And the first thing that, you know, I've seen on configuration is naming. And no matter what you're building or what language or anything, naming is hard. Naming is always hard. And so we just want to reiterate that here. Is what you're doing obvious? Is the name that you gave that feature flag obvious? In this case, if I had a feature flag named logging verbosity, is that obvious to you what it does? Maybe. I mean, I could take a guess that turning this on would in fact give me a higher verbose level of logging, but maybe not. It's hard to say. They haven't provided a lot of context here. And so I've seen this in a lot of cases where, you know, we want to get things done quick as engineers. Sometimes we just throw in these keys, right? Because that's the key you're going to have in your code, logging dash verbosity. And providing some thought into the name is hugely important and very practical. In this case, I might switch it so it says enable verbose logging. Well, that's great. Now I know that if I turn this on, it's going to increase my level of verbosity. I could even change this so that it was a multivariant, where it's an enumeration of different log levels entirely, depending on what you need. But the second part would be the description. The descriptions are there in most of the providers to give yourself some context. And so in this case, enables log level verbosity at the debug level. So that's great. I know exactly what it's going to do now. So use those descriptions where you can. And it just goes to reiterate why it's important, especially when you start to have hundreds of these, or you start to share them across teams. You know, including some thought and some patterns into how you create these is going to be important for your organization. Consistent default states. Some of the providers offer different ways to look at the flags. So in this case, you can have a disable verbose logging, which is kind of funny. Like, you know, why would you go enable versus disable in your naming convention? Then not only that, if I have disable verbose logging, when it's off, I could have it serve true as well. So there are so many different ways to configure these things, and it lets you do that. Just because you can do it doesn't mean that you should. So try to develop that consistent theme of how you're naming and what your default out of some of these would be. And fourthly, centralizing your flag access. So when you're actually in the code base and you're going to add these feature flags, you're going to actually have to add that key into your code and check the service if it's enabled. In this case, I have a function called enable verbose logging. And the reason you want to separate it out in this way is also to decouple the decision from the action, because you're going to use that potentially in multiple spots throughout your code base. And so it doesn't make sense for me to repeat that all over the place, of course. Not only that, your decision in itself might change or evolve in a couple different ways. First, it might change by, in this case, has logging platform v2. So I'm making a decision based on more than just the feature flag itself. There are a couple criteria for this decision that allows me a central spot to test it and to work with it. And this last one is near and dear to my heart because I've seen this one so much, and it's also it's very tempting to do this because it seems like such a great fit. But there are a couple of reasons not to use any feature flagging logic in dependency injection. So at a high level, your dependency injection often starts when your application starts up. So think about a container coming to life and hydrating up. And you need to add in a logging provider. In this case, I have an interface called iLogging provider. And based on our above decision, enable verbose logging, I can either add different implementations of this. So I might add the verbose logging provider or the default logging provider. And this seems like such a fantastic way for me to take advantage of dependency injection to just swap out the concrete implementation. But it gets us into a lot of trouble. The first case is, notice that in my decision, I'm not actually passing a user because I don't have a user. I'm at startup right now. This isn't actually a per request dependency that's hydrating. And so I could change that and defer that decision if you wanted to, depending on your language, by checking the incoming user context and then injecting at a per request at runtime level the provider. But generally speaking, this is a bad pattern. What I typically would want to do is have a default logging provider, and then within the default logging provider that's added, I would be checking feature flags to see at the very last possible moment what it would like me to do for my behavior. Very tempting though. Life cycle. So we touched on a couple life cycle questions. One that always comes up, it seems, once you dive into more details, is how do I know when I need a feature flag? And the teams that I've been working on from a DevOps culture have been trying to reverse that, so that instead we're asking the question, how do I know when I do not need a feature flag? So trying to shift that mentality to, we work and we develop using feature flags directly. And there are scenarios where you may want to consider reducing complexity, or that you don't actually need a feature flag. At a high level, if there's no risk to what you're doing, I'm thinking, I changed some text on a page, on an HTML page, as an example. Maybe there's some risk to what you're doing and you want to make sure you can revert that out because you're really bad at grammar or spelling. But generally speaking, that's pretty straightforward. There's not a lot of risk. I don't need to worry about trivial things like that from a feature flag perspective. Just get it fixed. That being said, there are bug fixes where sometimes the bug is bad enough that it doesn't warrant a feature flag. I would never want to go back to this bug if if what I'm introducing is even worse. Now, of course, you have to analyze that. It always depends on the situation you're in and the bug that you're fixing. But in some cases, it doesn't make sense to feature flag a bug. Maybe what you're doing is also non-deploy blocking. And so, whatever it is, it's not going to block the deploy. It could be sideline related. It could even be related to the infrastructure itself. Something that came up the other day was working through a Docker file. And, I'm not going to go ahead and I'm not going to add a feature flag inside a Docker file because it's not blocking on my deployment. It might be blocking my build, but that's a different problem that I'm going to get to very quickly from a binary sense. But sometimes it's just, if it doesn't affect a deploy or it's not going to block a deploy in any way, it's infrastructure related, you're not going to feature flag that potentially. And you may want to consider, if you're adding a feature flag within a feature flag, and maybe that's in another feature flag, it can, it seems ridiculous, but it can get out of control pretty quick, especially if you're working on a larger feature in itself that's taking much longer. I'm not saying it doesn't make sense to do this. I'm just saying to, as always, apply good principles and think about whether it makes sense to feature flag this behavior that is already behind another feature flag that we're working towards another epic on. And of course, another great question, how long do you keep feature flags around for? And for this one, I defer to this chart from Martin Fowler, which does a great job of kind of illustrating the 4 types that we've talked about. And so from a release toggle perspective, you know, on the different axes here, you can see how long do you keep it versus how dynamic it is. And from a release toggle perspective, they're you know, they're pretty quick. We get rid of them as quick as we can, to be honest. We don't want to be in that situation where the feature decision provider is down and getting some sort of other default back. And it creates tech debt, right? Keeping those around. So we want to eliminate those release toggles as quickly as we can once the feature is proved and in production and good to go. Experimental toggles, you know, we want to, they might live a little bit longer than release toggles because we're experimenting and deciding on the feature, but you want to get rid of them pretty quick as well. And then operational toggles, you can see its line actually extends kind of beyond the chart into years. And that's an example of where you have some of those kill switches, you have some of those maybe logging related switches that operationally, you're going to keep those indefinitely. And different feature decision providers offer the ability to mark them as permanent flags. In my own opinion, I don't believe that those types of flags should be created as feature flags. I think that using those inside the feature decision provider doesn't make sense. It doesn't offer me a clear separation of you know, what exactly is the code and the platform that we're building versus using it for the development process. And so we've established a pretty clear distinction at SPS Commerce and some of our teams where we don't use this for operational flags that are planned to be permanent. We actually build that in as a feature set. And typically that is augmented or changed or interacted with from an administrative console as well. That's part of the platform. And we don't necessarily want those operators going to LaunchDarkly to start flipping stuff in there. And the same would apply for permission toggles as well in terms of how long you keep them and how you use them. So I know we've had some questions about cleanup. And again, I can only offer some ideas about how to clean up. Number one observation, which you guys have been illustrating as well, is that the feature flag cleanup it's really hard. It seems to be the number one problem that teams have. They get started with it really easily, and then nothing ever gets cleaned up. Those flags just live there forever and quickly develop into a series of technical debt that gets harder and harder to pull out. And so some people even see feature flags as the worst kind of technical debt because you're actually maintaining those multiple code paths. It can be horrendous, you know, if you don't remove it downstream, especially when you're not supporting a feature anymore. It becomes unmaintainable. So it is really, really, really important to clean up and have a cleanup process defined for your organization as you get into adoption. Let's talk about a couple things. First of all, finding them. Yes, someone brought up there can be lots, there can be hundreds, and finding them is difficult, but we can use tooling to our advantage. Some of the feature management providers that we talked about, including LaunchDarkly, they offer like GitHub integration where it can actually compare some of the information, the stack information coming from the request to the GitHub source and actually tell you right in code, this is where it's used. It's pretty cool. But additionally, it also helps you by letting you know information about its usage. So maybe you can tell that a feature flag hasn't been used in the last 3 months. Okay, then rip it out. You can also work with abstractions. So that's where we talked about, you know, centralizing your decision logic. If you have that all in a single spot in a single service, or think about the creation of enumeration if you're in C# or Java, that's a great way to be able to just right click on something and say find usages and spider my code and find it. And also, you have to think about finding them from a distributed perspective. If you're in the microservice world and you are looking for these feature flags that are distributed across lots of your services, that can be a tough place to be in. One way to deal with that would be to have a shared reusable package with the enumeration in it. What that allows you to do is to deprecate them by removing an enumeration value and then redistributing the package. That's going to cause a breaking code change downstream. Which in this case is a good thing because we want to let people know that if you're using that flag and your code breaks, well, we're about to remove it from LaunchDarkly or a feature management provider. So you should clean it up now because it's going to go soon. You can also think about an exit criteria. In a lot of cases, these come in the teams that I work with. It's often discussed in terms of, okay, we're going to put this behind a feature flag. This is kind of how it's going to work because we're coordinating several engineers behind that flag to work on something new. So defining that exit criteria of how do I know when this is cleaned up? How do I know when it's done, that this flag can be removed, that we're good to go? One of the simplest ways to know is maybe the flag is turned on and it's been on for 3 months and it's been entirely on. It hasn't been like off for one user or anything like that. Ideally even less period of time, right? This has been on for 2 weeks and there's no issues, clean it up. But you can define that exit criteria too, working with your product owner to say, this is when we'll get rid of it when the time comes. It can be pretty ambiguous, the exit criteria. Think about that when you're working between teams, especially if you're working on a contract of a flag that is going to be consumed by multiple teams within the org. That's pretty important to discuss up front. Expiration is another way to work with the flags. So in some cases, you can use a fitness function, which might be like a unit test. That would actually break your build if it discovers that you have this feature flag in there that is older than 3 months, then just blow up. That's not something we support. We want you to remove that right away. Ensuring that when that does expire, you're removing those old tests is essential. I've just seen the tests left in that are causing performance nightmares in your build and increasing your build time. So make sure those are ripped out. And one of my favorite ones that I've been exploring, we haven't had the chance to really use this yet, is limiting of usage. Kind of more like a Kanban board style, right? Where you're allowed to have 10 flags in use at any given time on this team. And if you need an 11th flag, you can't start development on that. You need to go rip out one of your other flags or get one of those flags over the finish line if it needs to be. Because typically those releases, depending on the size of your team, might just be left there because someone didn't take it the last 10% to just say, oh yeah, okay, it's done, and I'll fully turn it on and then clean up the code. So that's a forcing function to help a team who might have feature flag out of control issues. And just to say it at an organizational level, it gets out of hand fast unless you're working towards identifying a process for using feature flags in a provider. It's amazing how quickly you bring on board a tool like that and just kind of goes across the organization, and now you're in a situation of trying to manage and clean that up. So think about these things up front in the management of your decision provider and what you're going to use, because if you get into that situation where you're putting all of your eggs in one basket, so to speak, with that dependency, you better trust them and have a good SLA specified. And the last one here would be Feature Flag Friday. It's something I always laughed about that we did a while back was failover Fridays, which was the idea that if there's anything in our system that hasn't been tested in failover, we're just failing that over every Friday. Just because if you're willing to do that on a Friday, you're probably going to trust in your system, right? If you really believe in it, do it at Friday at 5 o'clock. But nevertheless, just a regular cadence to have your teams think about, oh, right, what flags are we cleaning up might be one way to tackle it. And just getting them in there to review those feature flags, even if they're not limiting usage, is pretty important. I wanted to touch on experimentation because this is an example of, we've been talking a lot about feature flags and how great they are and the flexibility that it provides. But the reason I bring experimentation in this example is because feature flags aren't a solve for everything. There are cases where it doesn't make sense to use that, or there are other techniques that you may want to consider. So an example that might be experimentation, because we can use feature flags that we've been talking about for experimentation, but there are different types of experimentation you might be interested in. So in this case, we're going to perform a calculation. We're going to go to our feature decision provider and ask, is feature enabled? And then we're going to either choose the old code or the new code, and then we're going to produce a result. And that individual result, whether it be the old or the new, will be returned to the user. Another scientific approach to this that doesn't use feature flags in the same way would be to perform the calculation. In this case, we're not going to ask a feature decision provider. We're going to do both. We're going to do the old calculation and the new calculation. And in this case, we're only going to return the old calculation to the user. This might be a great scenario where I'm not willing to say that the new formula or the new code that I've come up with is actually as good as the old, and maybe it's providing back results to a user that are inaccurate. I'm not ready to do that based on my development experience in the dev environment. I need to see production data on it. And so that's where this example can come in, where then you can actually begin to publish your old and your new code, publish those results to your logging provider, whatever that might be, so you can analyze that and see how it works out. You can see in this case, we haven't used a feature flag at all to do that. you might use some other frameworks for that. And one of them would be GitHub has a framework for this called Scientist, which is excellent for this exact purpose. And you might consider using something like that as well. You could definitely compose this with multiple feature flags and turning things on and off and code it by hand, but there are other frameworks and other techniques that you can use. And so definitely look for those when it's appropriate. Feature flags does a lot, but doesn't do everything. And yeah, we can dive into some questions. That's the end of the scheduled content. And really at the end of the day, just focusing on that separation, right, of your deploy and your release are two totally different concepts that we want to have independent of each other. And there's a lot that you gain out of it, right? There's so many excellent architectural patterns and some of those elitisms that we get. But part of the purpose of what I hope you realized here is that it's not free, right? There's going to be a cost to developing it. We had those important realizations, but it is worth it, and you can practice it, and you become very, very efficient from a DevOps perspective with feature flags.